The morning of September 17th, 1862 smells like gunpowder and wet corn. The stalks in the Miller farm field are still standing, barely. A man named Ezra Karstens, a 23-year-old from Ohio who had never traveled more than 40 miles from his birthplace before enlisting, crouches behind a split-rail fence. The wood is damp beneath his fingers. His canteen is empty. Somewhere ahead, through the blue-gray haze that clings to the Maryland lowlands, a Confederate regiment is loading their rifles for the third time that hour. In his breast pocket, folded into quarters, is a letter from his mother that he has not yet opened. He is saving it, the way a man saves the last of something he knows he cannot replace. Before the sun clears the tree line, before the next volley, he will be dead. The letter will be found on his body and returned, unopened, to a woman in Columbus who will never fully understand what happened to her son, or why it had to happen here, on someone else's farmland, in a war that was supposed to be over in 90 days. This is the history that was never meant to make you comfortable, and in a few minutes, you will understand why. This is a story about how a nation built a machine of war, and then discovered, too late, that it had no off switch. If you find yourself drawn to history that refuses to be cleaned up or simplified, consider subscribing. There is more of this to come. Now, let us go back to the beginning. In the spring of 1861, the United States of America had not fought a major war on its own soil in nearly half a century. The men who would lead both armies, men like Ulysses Grant, William Sherman, Robert E. Lee, and Thomas Jackson, had been trained at West Point in the same classrooms, using the same textbooks, learning the same Napoleonic tactics that had defined European warfare in the early 19th century. They had seen action in Mexico. They had administered frontier posts, but none of them, not one, had commanded an army of the size that the coming war would demand. Nobody had. The United States Army, as of January 1861, numbered fewer than 17,000 men. It was, by European standards, a modest constabulary force. What was about to be unleashed bore no resemblance to anything that had come before it on American ground. And already, in the ledgers of regimental clerks and county enlistment offices across 23 states, names were being written down, names that would later be crossed out. The first miscalculation was made by almost everyone simultaneously. In the North, Secretary of State William Seward told anyone who would listen that the rebellion would be suppressed within 60 days. In the South, fire-eaters in the Confederate Congress insisted that one Southern soldier was worth 10 Northern factory workers in a fight. Both sides called for volunteers. Both sides were overwhelmed by the response. Tens of thousands of men, farmers, clerks, school teachers, blacksmiths, left their homes with a kind of festive energy that is difficult to comprehend from this distance. They believed, with complete sincerity, that they were marching toward a single decisive battle, a battle that would settle everything. Then they would come home. What neither side had calculated was the rifle. To understand why the Civil War killed so many men, you have to understand what had changed in the decades before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter. In the Napoleonic era, the tactical framework in which every senior officer on both sides had been trained, the standard infantry weapon was the smooth-bore musket. It was accurate to perhaps 80 yards. In massed formations, soldiers fired in volleys at close range, then closed with the bayonet. The math of this kind of warfare, while brutal, was somewhat predictable. Casualties were high, but they were compressed into short, violent exchanges. Armies recovered. Armies re-engaged. By 1861, the smoothbore musket was gone. In its place was the rifle musket, most commonly the Springfield Model 1861 in the Union Army, and the British-made Enfield in Confederate hands. These weapons fired the mini ball, a soft lead projectile that expanded upon firing, gripping the rifled barrel and spinning as it exited. The result was a weapon accurate to 400 yards or more in trained hands. Some marksmen claimed kills at 500. The effective killing range of infantry had increased by a factor of 5. The tactics had not changed at all. Officers on both sides continued to order frontal assaults. They continued to mass their men in linear formations and march them toward entrenched positions. They did this because the textbooks said this was how battles were won: a massed charge, a concentrated blow, a breakthrough. What the textbooks had not accounted for was what happened when the men defending those positions could see you coming from a quarter-mile away and had time to fire, reload, and fire again before you reached them. The men who crossed those open fields did not walk into musket volleys. They walked into aimed rifle fire from soldiers who had time to select individual targets. The casualty rates from the war's early engagements should have forced a complete reconsideration of tactics. They did not. At Ball's Bluff in October 1861, Union forces suffered casualties approaching 50% in a single afternoon. At Shiloh in April 1862, both sides combined lost over 23,000 men in 2 days. The response from commanders on both sides was not to abandon the frontal assault, but to refine it, to concentrate more men, to move more quickly, to coordinate the advance with artillery. The assault continued. The men continued to die. There was a young colonel named William Blount, a composite drawn from the letters and diaries of several junior officers whose accounts survive in regimental archives, who wrote to his wife from a camp outside Corinth, Mississippi, in the weeks after Shiloh. The letter does not contain anything remarkable by the standards of Civil War correspondence. He describes the mud. He describes the smell. He says the men are tired in a way that sleep does not touch. He mentions, almost in passing, that the regimental clerk had run out of space in the casualty ledger and had begun a second volume. Names filling pages, pages filling books, and him, still alive, watching the books get thicker. What is remarkable about the letter is its final line, which reads, in paraphrase, that he has begun to believe the war will not end when one side wins. It will end when there are no more men left to fight it. He was not wrong. He was simply too early. The mathematics of Civil War casualties are staggering in a way that resists easy comprehension. Over the course of 4 years, approximately 620,000 soldiers died, though more recent scholarship, examining previously uncounted Confederate records, has revised that estimate upward to as many as 750,000 or more. To place this in context, the United States lost approximately 405,000 soldiers in all of World War II, fighting across multiple continents over 4 years. The Civil War, fought within the borders of a single country, killed more Americans than every other war in the nation's history combined. But the rifle alone does not explain this. The rifle explains why men died when they were shot. It does not explain why so many more died in hospital tents, in prison camps, in the mud beside roads that led nowhere useful. To understand the full scale of the catastrophe, you have to understand what happened after a man was wounded, and what happened when armies tried to feed, clothe, and shelter hundreds of thousands of soldiers in an era before the systems existed to do it. Begin with a single image. A barn in Northern Virginia, converted overnight into a field hospital after the Second Battle of Bull Run in August 1862. The smell of blood and chloroform is thick enough to taste. A surgeon named Jonathan Letterman, a real man who would go on to redesign the Union Army's entire medical evacuation system, stands at a table made of 2 sawhorses and a door. He has been operating for 11 hours. His instruments are laid out in a row beside him, wiped between patients but not boiled, not sterilized, because the concept of sterilization as a medical necessity does not yet exist. He is not negligent. He is not cruel. He is a man doing the best science of his time in the worst possible conditions. And the best science of his time is not enough. Germ theory, the understanding that infectious disease is caused by microorganisms, was not yet accepted medical consensus in 1861. Louis Pasteur had published his foundational work, but it had not yet penetrated clinical practice in Europe, let alone in Army field hospitals in Virginia and Tennessee. Surgeons did not sterilize their instruments between operations because they did not understand why they should. They operated with bare hands because rubber gloves had not yet been introduced into surgical practice. They left wounds open to drain because the alternative, closure, seemed to invite the infection that many still believed was a natural stage of healing. The mini-ball compounded every one of these problems. Unlike a modern high-velocity rifle round, which tends to pass through soft tissue cleanly, the soft lead mini-ball tumbled on impact, flattening and fragmenting, shattering bone and carrying cloth fibers and dirt deep into the wound. A man shot in the arm or leg did not have a clean puncture wound. He had a cavity of destroyed tissue, splintered bone, and contaminated debris. Amputation, in this context, was not butchery. It was the fastest way to remove the source of the sepsis that would otherwise kill the patient within days. The surgeons working 18-hour shifts were not savages. They were men doing the only thing they knew how to do, as fast as they could do it, watching men die faster than they could operate. And then there was the dying, that happened nowhere near a battlefield at all. Disease killed 2 of every 3 soldiers who did not come home. Dysentery and typhoid spreading through summer encampments where latrines had been dug too close to the water supply. Pneumonia moving through winter quarters where the tents were inadequate and the firewood was wet. Measles cutting through regiments of rural volunteers who had never been exposed to it as children and now encountered it crowded together by the thousands. The men most vulnerable to all of this were the same men who were poorly fed, inadequately clothed, and sleeping on ground that had already been used as a latrine by the regiment before them. Which is to say, nearly all of them, nearly all of the time. You might be watching this and thinking, these are the failures of an unprepared nation, thrust into a war it did not understand, using weapons and tactics and medicine that had not yet caught up with each other. And that is true. But it is not the complete truth. Because alongside the chaos, alongside the genuine ignorance and the genuine tragedy, there existed something else. There existed systems. There existed deliberate choices. There existed men who understood, with increasing clarity, what they were sending other men into, and sent them anyway. Not out of ignorance, out of calculation. Ulysses Grant understood this arithmetic better than almost anyone. Grant has been characterized by his critics, then and since, as a butcher, a man who spent lives without counting them. The record does not fully support this characterization, but it does not fully refute it either. Grant believed, with a clarity that bordered on the merciless, that the only way to end the war was to end Confederate capacity to fight it, and that the only way to do that was to engage Confederate armies continuously, without rest, without the operational pauses that had allowed both sides to recover and refit after major battles. As his biographers record, in a paraphrase that circulates widely through the literature, his direction to subordinates was something to the effect of, find the enemy, reach him as quickly as possible, strike as hard as possible, and keep moving. This was not the strategy of a man who did not understand what it cost. This was the strategy of a man who had decided the cost was acceptable. The Overland Campaign of 1864, from the Wilderness in May to the Siege of Petersburg in June, generated casualties on a scale that shocked even veterans. In 6 weeks of nearly continuous combat, the Army of the Potomac suffered approximately 65,000 casualties. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia suffered approximately 35,000. Grant's army was larger. It could absorb the losses at terrible human cost in a way that Lee's army could not. This was the logic. This was the system. It was not madness. It was arithmetic applied to human beings. In the Confederate capital of Richmond, the calculus was different but equally cold. Jefferson Davis and his military advisors understood that the South could not win a prolonged war of attrition. The Confederate States had roughly a third of the North's population, a fraction of its industrial capacity, and a railroad network deteriorating with every passing month. The only path to Confederate victory ran through Northern political will, specifically through making the cost of the war so high, so sustained, so visible in Northern homes that the Northern electorate would refuse to continue it. Every Confederate soldier who killed 2 Union soldiers before dying was, in a terrible sense, doing exactly what the strategy required. The men in the field were not pieces on a chessboard, but the men in the capitals were, in fact, moving pieces on a chessboard. The pieces were men. The prison camps occupy a particular place in the moral geography of the Civil War. A place that is still contested, still politically charged, still used by partisans on both sides to make arguments that have more to do with the present than with the past. The facts, stripped of their political freight, are these. On both sides, the prison system was catastrophically inadequate, and men died in it by the tens of thousands. Andersonville, formerly known as Camp Sumter, was established in February 1864 in southwestern Georgia to hold Union prisoners of war. At its peak in August 1864, the camp held nearly 33,000 men in a space designed for 10,000. There was almost no shelter. There was a stream running through the camp that served as both water source and latrine. The rations were insufficient and deteriorating. The Confederate administration of the camp was aware of these conditions. Documents surviving from Confederate quartermaster records show repeated requests for additional food, additional lumber for shelter, additional medical supplies. Most of these requests were denied or left unanswered, not because the Confederacy was indifferent to the deaths of prisoners, or not only because of that, but because the Confederacy in 1864 was running out of everything. It could barely feed its own soldiers. The men at Andersonville died at the end of a supply chain that was collapsing at every link simultaneously. 13,000 men died at Andersonville. The commandant, Henry Wirtz, was tried after the war and hanged, the only person executed for war crimes in connection with the Civil War. Whether he bore individual responsibility for a catastrophe that was fundamentally systemic remains a question that historians continue to dispute. What is not disputed is that 13,000 men are buried in a field in Georgia, and that many of them died not from battle wounds, but from scurvy and dysentery and exposure, in a camp that appeared on Confederate military maps as a properly functioning prisoner of war facility. A name, a number, a notation, transferred, deceased, processed. Union prison camps in the North were not as lethal as Andersonville. They were not good. The camp at Elmira, New York, known to Confederate prisoners as Hellmira, had a mortality rate of approximately 25%. Men died of pneumonia in the northern winters, from contaminated water, from inadequate clothing. The difference in death rates between Union and Confederate prison camps is real, and it reflects in part the difference in available resources. It does not reflect a difference in fundamental humanity. Both systems processed human beings through a bureaucratic infrastructure that had been designed to hold a fraction of the men it was asked to hold, and both systems failed those men at an institutional level that individual cruelty or individual kindness could only marginally affect. By the winter of 1864, the war had developed a rhythm that had no precedent in American experience. It was no longer a series of battles separated by long periods of maneuvering and preparation. It was continuous. In Virginia, the armies had been locked in siege operations around Petersburg since June. Men lived in trenches, elaborate networks of earthworks that stretched for miles, expanded and deepened over months, becoming in effect underground cities of mud and timber and misery. They slept in them, they ate in them, they were shelled in them around the clock. The shelling did not always kill. Sometimes it simply kept not killing, hour after hour, day after day. A man could hear a shell arc overhead and strike 30 yards away and feel the earth shudder through his boots, and the man beside him would be dead, and he would be alive, and there was no logic to it, no system, no reason. Surviving veterans described what happened to a man's mind under sustained artillery bombardment as something different from fear, something beyond it. Fear implied a specific threat that could be identified and responded to. What the trenches produced was a different animal entirely, the slow erosion of the part of the self that believed any action made a difference. You ate, you slept when you could. You did not look too long at the men around you, because looking meant noticing when they were gone. The medical records of the period contain entries that military doctors struggled to name. Men who could not stop trembling. Men who went deaf without physical cause. Men who woke screaming and could not explain what they had seen. Men who sat entirely still and did not respond when spoken to directly. The period term was soldier's heart, a vague diagnostic category that encompassed what later generations would call shell shock, combat fatigue, and eventually post-traumatic stress disorder. The men diagnosed with it were sometimes returned to duty. They were sometimes discharged. They were rarely given anything that would today be recognized as treatment. In the discharge papers of many of these men, the listed reason reads simply, disability. The specific nature of the disability was not recorded. The ledger had no column for what they were actually carrying. The letters sent home from the trenches at Petersburg are among the most remarkable documents to survive the Civil War. Remarkable not for their eloquence, though some are eloquent, but for what they do not say. Men who had been prolific correspondents in the war's early months became terse. The letters shortened. The details became sparse. One soldier, a composite drawn from the correspondence of several Pennsylvania infantrymen preserved in regimental archive collections, sent home 17 letters across the 6 months of the Petersburg siege. In the first letter, he describes the landscape, the weather, the men in his company, his thoughts about how the war might end. By the final letter, written 3 weeks before he was killed by a Confederate sharpshooter, the entire text reads, in paraphrase, "He is well. He hopes she is well. The garden should be planted early this year." There is a particular silence in a letter like that. It is not the silence of a man with nothing to say. It is the silence of a man who has decided that what he has to say cannot travel the distance between where he is and where she is. The experience had no words she would recognize. The words he had used before no longer fit. And so he told her about the garden, and she saved the letter, and he did not come home. The war ended in April 1865. Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. The remaining Confederate armies surrendered in the weeks that followed. The political questions that the war had been fought over, slavery, secession, the nature of the Union, were answered, in the most brutal possible way, by the outcome. 4 million enslaved people were freed. The Confederate States were brought back into the Union by force. The legal structure of human bondage in the United States was destroyed. What was not destroyed, what could not be destroyed by military victory alone, was the social structure that slavery had built. The black codes, the convict leasing system, the systematic exclusion from land ownership, from voting, from legal protection, from physical safety. The war had ended one system, and in the years and decades that followed, a new architecture of exclusion was constructed in its place. This is a story for another time, but it cannot be left unmentioned here, because any account of why the Civil War was so devastating that ignores what it was fought over is not a history. It is an evasion. The men who survived came home to a country that had no infrastructure for receiving them. There were no veterans' hospitals in any modern sense. There were no mental health services. There was a pension system, eventually, that became the largest expenditure in the federal budget by the 1890s, a fact that is largely forgotten. There were also hundreds of thousands of men who were not visibly wounded, who had not lost limbs, who were classified as able-bodied and returned to their former lives, carrying inside them things that the 19th century had no language to describe and no institutions to address. They came back to farms and storefronts and families who had kept their names in letters, on rosters, in prayer, and who now looked at the men standing in their doorways and tried to find, in those faces, the ones they remembered. In the years after the war, a process began that historians call the lost cause, the systematic reimagining of the Confederacy in terms that removed slavery from its central place and replaced it with a narrative of honor, states' rights, and tragic heroism. Confederate monuments went up across the South, and eventually the North, between the 1890s and the 1950s. Textbooks in Southern states taught children that the Civil War had been about constitutional principle, not human bondage. The Confederate battle flag was flown over state houses. The men who had fought to preserve slavery were reframed as men who had fought for their homes, their families, their way of life, a framing that carefully avoided examining what that way of life had required. This erasure was not accidental. It was organized. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, founded in 1894, lobbied actively for textbook content in Southern states, for the placement of monuments, for the names given to schools and military bases. The process was documented in their own publications and meeting minutes. They were explicit about their goals. The goal was not to preserve history. The goal was to shape it, to determine which version of events would be passed to the next generation and which would be buried beneath a softer story. Names were kept. Contexts were removed. The ledger was rewritten from the last page backward. The result was that for nearly a century, a significant portion of American children were taught a version of the Civil War that omitted the public address given by Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens in March 1861, a speech available in its entirety in the Congressional Record and multiple historical archives, in which Stephens argued, in his own words, as later historians have rendered them in paraphrase, that the Confederacy's foundations rested upon the principle that the races were not equal and that the institution of slavery was the natural condition of the African. This speech existed. It was given publicly. It was reported in newspapers across the country. It was then, for decades, absent from classrooms. The name remained. The meaning was crossed out. What remains, when the monuments are debated and the textbooks are revised, and the arguments have been made and challenged and made again, is something that resists the tidy conclusions that histories are supposed to provide. There are the bones. Archaeologists working at Civil War battle sites continue to find human remains. Men buried hastily in the immediate aftermath of fighting, sometimes in mass graves, sometimes alone, almost always without individual markers. The Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History maintains skeletal collections from Civil War-era contexts that continue to yield new information about nutrition, disease, and the physical reality of what these men endured. Some of the remains can be identified through comparative DNA analysis. Most cannot. They are recorded in databases under case numbers, a number where a name used to be. There are the letters that were never sent. Collections and archives across the country contain correspondence found on the bodies of men killed in action. Letters sealed and addressed but never dispatched. Some still in the envelopes, some folded inside coats or tucked into boots. Archivists have debated the ethics of opening them. Some have been opened. They contain, almost without exception, ordinary things. Instructions about farms, messages for children, apologies for things that no longer matter, declarations of love to people who have been dead for 150 years. There is, in the National Archives in Washington, a ledger from the Army of the Potomac's Medical Directorate, covering the period from May to December 1864. It is a large book, bound in worn leather, filled with columns of names and dates and diagnoses and outcomes. Most entries end with one of a small number of notations: returned to duty, transferred, discharged, or a symbol, a small mark in the right-hand column that the ledger's key identifies as meaning died. The symbol appears, on some pages, more often than all other notations combined. The names beside those symbols are, for the most part, still legible. They were real people. They had the unopened letters in their pockets, and the early planted gardens waiting for them, and the mothers who would never fully understand. The Civil War killed more Americans than any other conflict in the nation's history. We know this. We repeat it. We have made it into a statistic, which is what we do with numbers too large to hold any other way. But a statistic is also a distance. A number does not tremble. A number does not go silent halfway through a letter and write about the garden instead. The question the war leaves behind is not really a historical question at all. It is a question about what a society is willing to accept as a cost, and what stories it tells itself afterward about why that cost was worth paying, about who got to make that decision, and about what it means that the men who made it are the ones whose names we remember, while the men who paid it are recorded in a ledger in Washington as a small mark in a right-hand column.